News Now is brought to you by the Bank of Guam, the People's Bank. From the Pacific News Center in Hagåtña, Guam, here's Clint Rigel and Janella Carrera with Betsy Brown and Roselle Romanes. PNC Sports with Blake Watson. And weather with Joanna O. With your news now.
Hafa and good evening, Guam. I'm Janella Carrera, and you're watching PNC's News Now. We're broadcasting live on Guam and in Saipan.
And I'm Clint Rigel. Thanks for tuning in. Topping your news tonight, 2 intoxicated students were maced by school resource officers at George Washington High School today after reportedly assaulting an employee. Police were also called to the scene, and as PNC's Betsy Brown reports, a taser was deployed on one of the students.
A student at George Washington High School was stunned by a taser today, and a student was maced with pepper spray. GPD officers were called to respond to 2 beyond control students, who GPD officer AJ Balahaja says were intoxicated. DOE Deputy Superintendent Rob Millay told PNC that an employee was also injured in the encounter.
There is a report that a couple of students became aggressive to an employee. At which time the SROs came to provide support to help get control of the situation, where they brought them to the school administration, who notified the Guam Police Department as well as the parents, and then took their appropriate administrative actions.
While SROs do not carry tasers, Millay says they do carry pepper spray. However, he was not able to confirm whether or not that was used today.
So what we had was the SROs having to mace the 2 students. One, as far as I know, that was combative, ended up having a dry, they call it drive, as in driver, dry stun, where they take the actual taser, and instead of deploying the prongs into the individual, they took it and did a drive stun to the individual.
Balahaja says it was an officer from the Hagåtña precinct to tase the student. This is the second time the deployment of a taser by a GPD officer has made the news this week. On Sunday, a taser was fired at a tourist in Tumon, and an internal affairs investigation was launched at that time. Balahaja says an incident report will be filed regarding today's use of a taser as well. Betsy Brown, PNC News.
And both of the students were taken to GMH for observation, and Deputy Superintendent Rob Millay says the parents of the students were also notified. In other news, the student who reportedly brought a gun to St. Paul Christian School on Wednesday has been arrested. Guam Police spokesman Officer AJ Balahaja says the student was a male 17-year-old who was charged with possession of a firearm in a school zone, possession of a firearm without a firearms ID, and possession of a concealed firearm. St. Paul Academic Administrator Manny Insiang told PNC yesterday that they took control of the situation immediately. They contacted GPD as soon as they found out that a student had brought a weapon to school, isolated the student, and confiscated the firearm. Balahaja says the gun was not loaded and that the student did not make any threats to any of the students. Last night, the school sent out a notice via email to parents in which they wrote about their extensive training with GPD regarding potential emergency situations. Quote, "We are currently working with the police department to ensure that safety continues. Because this is currently under the investigation of the police, we cannot comment further," the email reads. The school also announced that the student has been expelled. The student is confined at the Department of Youth Affairs.
The government of Guam has been good with paying out tax refunds for the past few years, but how are we doing financially this fiscal year? Although the governor's office says we're collecting the revenues we projected or expected to collect, 3 agencies have told PNC that they are behind in receiving cash allotments by millions of dollars.
So in the first quarter of the fiscal year is over now. Based on the numbers we have so far, are we meeting revenue projections?
Actually, as of December 2014, we are on target with our revenue projections.
Okay. So basically, we're collecting the amount of revenue that we were anticipating.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And so are we also on track to meet revenue projections at the end of the year?
According to the numbers that we have so far, we are actually on target for the year. as far as projections are concerned.
However, 3 education agencies have confirmed for PNC that they are behind in receiving their cash allotments from the Department of Administration. Jane Flores says GCC is behind $4 million. Jonas Macapinlac confirmed that UOG is behind by about $5 million, and Taling Taitano says DOE is behind by about $8.8 million. That's a total of $17.8 million that have not been received by these 3 agencies alone. PNC tried to look up the latest financial reports for GovGuam online on the governor's BBMR website, but the financial revenue and expenditure reports end in November 2014. This despite the fact that there are numerous statutes requiring monthly reports for revenues and expenditures. The good news is $1.3 million in tax refunds are going out today to just over 300 people.
I believe this is January 16th for all status A error-free tax returns.
Santos says they're providing the agencies with the funding they need to meet operational needs, and he says GovGuam manages the budget across the fiscal year and not month to month. In addition to this, GovGuam also has set aside a 15% reserve.
Wysall veterinarian Dr. Joel Joseph was back in court today for an evidentiary hearing regarding controlled substances that were seized from his clinic during a police raid back in 2013. He says an inventory of what was taken shows some items are now missing, but public health believes Dr. Joseph was obtaining some of his drugs illegally. At an evidentiary hearing today, Dr. Joel Joseph told Judge Anita Sokola that in retrieving some of the items that were seized during a raid, he discovered that some veterinary drugs went missing. In May 2013, Department of Public Health and the Guam Police Department raided Dr. Joel Joseph's Wysall clinic, taking veterinary medicine, computer equipment, camera memory cards, and other items. Earlier this month, Judge Anita Sokola ordered the return of some of the items that were seized, but Public Health objected to other items being returned.
But there are a large number of items, all of which are non-controlled drugs, that also disappeared during this raid. The filming of the taking of these drugs has been wiped out on the SD cards. And I thought we'd settle the issue on the SD cards with the Adkins case, wiping out information, things like that.
Objection to the narrative form and no question pending. Sustained.
Dr. Joseph says he found discrepancies in the inventory sheet that shows what items were seized and what items were returned. For example, he says some drugs typically list how many bottles are in a box, but on the sheet provided by Public Health, it only lists how many boxes, but without the bottles. Meanwhile, Assistant Attorney General Happy Rons focused on Dr. Joseph's failure to obtain an import-export registration from the Drug Enforcement Agency. Dr. Joseph admitted on the stand that he lacked this registration, despite having carried some drugs he obtained from foreign countries.
You did not have an import-export registration on May 8, 2013, right?
DEA? No.
Dr. Joseph emphasized that he is not violating his agreement because he has been in constant communication with a DEA agent and that the two have agreed that he would properly dispose of these drugs as soon as they are returned to him.
If the court released the drugs back to you, you would have them in your possession, right?
That is correct.
And some of those drugs came from foreign countries, right?
That is correct.
And you didn't have an import-export registration for those drugs from the foreign countries, right?
That is correct.
So then, if you took them back, you would be violating the agreement that you made with the U.S. Department of Justice.
Objection. Question calls for a legal conclusion.
Sustained.
The hearing continued this afternoon. Public Health continued to argue that returning these drugs to Dr. Joseph would be a violation of his agreement. But Dr. Joseph's counsel, Attorney Mitch Thompson, questioned whether Public Health is legally allowed to even carry these drugs themselves. The hearing has been continued to February 25th at 3 p.m.
And are you wondering why it's been so cold lately? Well, the folks at the National Weather Service say it's due to cold, dry air coming from Siberia over Japan and into this region. NWS forecaster Carl McElroy says this could be a very bad dry season with a good chance of a lot of fires. It's been colder than normal because cold, dry air from Siberia has been taking a shorter route to Guam than normal. NWS forecaster Carl McElroy explains how the air normally flows and how it's flowing now.
But I mean, the air will start out over Asia and come out farther to the east of Japan and then circle around and come back from the northeast. But now the air is coming off of Asia and taking a shorter, more direct north to south path over us.
This means the cold, dry air from Asia spends less time over tropical waters where it has a chance to warm up and pick up moisture. This cold air has resulted in lower than normal temperatures for Guam. McElroy says the lows for nights have been as low as 70 to 75 degrees, and he wouldn't be surprised if some areas have gotten as cold as the high 60s.
This isn't unprecedented. This hasn't happened recently, but between 1971 and 2000, there have been some daily record lows as low as the high 50s.
McElroy says this weather could continue for the next few weeks, well into March. This, in turn, means we will probably have a very dry season and a good chance of a lot of fires.
It's looking like this could be maybe as bad as it's been in several years. Right now, fuels are still drying out, but if this keeps up, things could get quite bad in a couple of weeks, although, yeah, would not be surprised, especially over this weekend, to see a couple of large fires down south.
McElroy says the weather should begin to get warmer by April.
Well, we go now to Roselle Romanes, who has a very fun story coming up after the break.
I just interviewed Kimmy from Power 98 about 2015 Class Act Senior Lift Up Challenge.
We're ready for your submission, seniors.
Step it up.
Step it up.
Stay tuned for more.